I never imagined a simple ride through Silver Hollow would turn my world upside down. But some things, fate, luck, the kind of accidents that look accidental, only in hindsight, arrive when you released ready for them. My horse had been fidgety, hooves clinking against the river stones, when a noise cut through the canyon air that did belong to birds or wind. At first it was faint, a thread on the breeze, then it sharpened into a cry, raw, urgent, and utterly human. I spurred the mare forward. Around the bend the current ran faster than it ought to, throwing white water against the banks, and there she was, a young girl, hair braided and whipping against her face, being dragged by the river like driftwood. Her coat clung to her small frame. Her arms beat the water in frantic arcs. I'd seen a lot of things out here, bad weather, bad tempers, worse luck, but nothing like the look in her eyes then, pure panic, pure clinging-to-life panic. There was a second to waste. I vaulted off, boots sinking into the cold riverbed. The water hit me like knives, stealing my breath, but the only thing that mattered was reaching her. The current bucked me, shoved me sideways, but I kept moving, hand after hand, until my fingers closed on her wrist. She fought me for a moment, half out of fear, half out of the shock of being grabbed by a stranger. Then something in her loosened, and I hauled her toward the shallows. We staggered to the muddy bank together. For a long time she just lay there, chest heaving, coughing up river water. Her lashes were clumped with grit. Her skin had that raw, sun-baked look young folks get when they've been traveling. When she finally lifted her head, her gaze darted from me to the trees like she was measuring where danger might still be hiding. I asked her name, and she did answer at once. Her lips trembled. Her clothes were leather and canvas, soaked and clinging, and she smelled like smoke and riverweed. She had a quiet sort of beauty, not the kind that begs attention, but the kind that grows on you if you give it a minute, fierce, spare, fragile. I offered her my hand, trying to sound more casual than I felt. Slowly, cautiously, she took it. Her fingers were small and cold, and for a second I thought that would be the end of it, that she'd stand, brush herself off, and disappear into the pines, returning to whatever life had pulled her from. But she didn't leave. When I swung up into the saddle and turned to ride, she walked out from the trees and fell in step behind us. I told her to go back, that she did. Owe me anything, but she shook her head and kept pace, barefoot on the cool brush. All day she trailed me in silence, content to be near without speaking. At camp she waited at the edge of the firelight like some small animal deciding whether to trust the world. When I tossed her a portion of beans and jerky, she took it with quiet thankfulness and ate in measured bites, eyes never leaving my face. I wanted to ask 100 questions. Why was she in the river? Where were her people? How long had she been alone? But sometimes asking can fracture what's left of a person, and something in her silence told me to wait. So I didn't push. I cooked, adjusted the tack, and kept my face lit by the flames until the night grew thin and the stars thickened above. Under that wide, indifferent sky she finally spoke. Her voice was soft and made the night feel heavier, not with threat, but with something like old sorrow. She told me, in slow pieces, that raiders had come through the valley weeks before. They'd de-scattered the small bands that lived nearby, burned shelters, taken horses. She'd been separated when the smoke and shouting tore everyone apart. In her broken sentences it was clear. She'd been traveling to find what remained of her family. The river had been a crossing she misjudged. The water had almost taken her whole. Her story came out in fits and starts. Sometimes the words caught, as if pulled from a wound that hadn't. Stopped bleeding. When she said she had nothing left, only a will to survive, I believed her without reservation. Then she looked at me steady, unblinking, and told me I had saved her. After that she said she would, to leave my side. I laughed then, a small, surprised sound, and told her I was a hero. I was a drifter with a horse and a bad habit of getting into other people's troubles. She only shook her head, that same quiet certainty in her eyes. In her world, apparently bonds like that were not casual things. They were oaths. They were chains and anchors both. Dawn found her seated by the cooling embers, braids still damp, her face turned toward me like she been waiting for something. In that moment something shifted inside me. I had pulled a person from death, and had, by that action, pulled something else along with her. Responsibility, perhaps, or fate. I had no choice but to accept that my life had been altered. The following days tested us both. The girl, her name, I learned later, was Asha, kept to my shadow. She gathered water before I asked, set the little camp with deft hands, and watched me, always watching. as if cataloging every scar and story on my face. We rode through scrub and sage, up ridge lines that cut the sky, and down hollows that smelled of damp earth and old bones. She said little, but when she did, the words were spare and honest. I tried to send her away at first, to be rid of the obligation. I'd lived alone long enough to know how dangerous attachments could be. They mess with your judgment. They make you soft in ways the world takes advantage of. But Asha had a stubbornness that wasn't loud but dug in like roots. She refused to leave. She said she could go back to the emptiness waiting for her where her people had been. She said the river had given her life through me, and because of that I was part of her path now. There's a kind of humility in watching someone you thought helpless reveal a spine you hadn't expected. It started to annoy, then impress, and finally steady me. We fell into a rhythm. I taught her how to read the sky for storms, how to check a horse for a fever, how to tighten a girth without waking a sleeping animal. She taught me how to mend a frayed braid, hummed songs whose words I did not know but whose tunes crept into my bones, and showed me small ritual for honoring things, the river, the trail, the dead, that made me feel a little less like a man wandering through a world that didn't want him. The bond between us grew not because of grand speeches, but because of small, mundane things. The way she would wake before dawn and sit in silence until the sun felt safe. The way she would warm a frayed blanket and lay it over me when I fell into a fevered sleep. The way, once, when a storm trapped us in a narrow draw, she braided my hair with the grave concentration of someone keeping a life. We slid into a kind of companionship I'd been starving for. And then, as is common in these parts, trouble found us. Smoke rose on the horizon one evening, a thin finger that widened as we rode. Asha, shoulder stiffened, and when I asked, she pointed with a crooked finger and whispered that it might be her people. Against better judgment, against everything that told me to ride the other way and keep my own skin, I followed her down. We found ruin. The ground was scarred, tents and huts half burned, the smell of ash and choking charcoal hanging in the air. Tracks and debris marked a struggle, splintered poles, a childish toy, crushed under hoof, a broken silver amulet half buried in mud. Asha knelt and ran her fingers over the earth like she was touching the face of someone she loved. She found scraps of cloth that might have been a shawl, a scorched cooking pot, footprints that led off toward the Badlands. Her grief was a quiet thing that neither begged for pity nor tried to hide. She sat on the cold ground and wept with a sound like a wind through dry leaves. I had nothing to say that could stitch that hole closed. I only sat beside her and let my silence carry the weight of sympathy. She rose after a while, eyes sharper, the old flame of purpose lighting them. She said she could not search alone. Because I had pulled her from the water, she said I was part of this hunt now. She called me kin, in a language I was only learning the shape of, and it felt heavier than any title I'd ever earned. We looked for tracks, for the signs the raiders had left. We questioned other travelers we met, bartered information for tobacco and a strip of dried meat. Every answer was a narrower angle into the same awful truth. The band that had come through these parts was large and cruel. They rode like storms and left ruins in their wake. Sometimes we found evidence of where they'd been. A line of scorched brush, a cluster of abandoned saddles, but rarely did we find the people themselves. Once, on a night, when the moon hung low and swollen, the raiders found us. They poured out of the dark like crows, shouting and firing. Horses reared, lanterns smashed, and the camp that we had built in the open turned into a maelstrom. I fought with the kind of desperation you discover only when everything you have is on the line. My revolver barked, my hands moved on muscle and memory. Asha was a storm of her own. Not with a gun, but with raw courage. She picked up a burning log and swung it with a force that sent one of the riders tumbling from his mount. She ducked and rolled and moved in a rhythm that was both terrifying and beautiful. We held them off until the air tasted like wet ash and the screaming faded. When the last of the raiders fled into the pines, the world seemed to inhale slowly, like it had been holding its breath. Asha stood with her chest heaving and smoke in her hair. She had cuts and bruises, but her face was unbroken. In the aftermath, as we bound wounds and counted losses, I realized I'd been wrong about so many things. She was to child clinging to me for safety. She was a warrior in miniature, forged by loss. After that night, our relationship shifted again. Gratitude had given way to reciprocity. She no longer followed me out of obligation alone. She walked beside me because she chose to. I opened up to her, which is harder than it sounds for a man used to keeping his past under lock and chain. I told her about the faces I could forget the choices that had chased me here, the mistakes thought I could bury by moving on. She listened without comment, only the occasional hum of a tune or a soft word in her tongue that made the confessions less sharp. In return, she taught me things that belonged to her people, small rituals for respect, old songs about the river and the stars, ways to call the land by its true names. She told me stories that were half ghost and half instruction, of ancestors who read the weather like a book, of women who crossed deserts with children on their backs and never asked for reward. Those tales patched together something in me I hadn't, noticed was torn. They gave me a map back to a kind of morality I'd been missing. Time wore on. We scoured the countryside for weeks. We followed whispers and rumors, asked favors, and made enemies. Sometimes we found traces that promised a reunion, a scrawled note nailed to a post, a survivor's mark carved into the bark of an old juniper, and would race toward it only to find another empty camp or a road swallowed by the Badlands. There were nights when I thought the whole quest was a fool errand. There were quieter nights when I would watch Asha sleep and count the breaths between heartbeats, waiting for the morning to tell me we have to start again. Slowly, though, our luck changed. A muleteer on the outskirts of a dusty trading post remembered a group that had been pushed north months ago. A woman we helped string up a cow in exchange for tobacco, said she. Seen riders heading toward the headland with prisoners. We tracked and hunted and bargained, trailing a scent like smoke in the wind. When we finally found them, a small band huddled near a ravine with a few survivors. Hiding among the rocks, it was to the triumphant scene I'd imagined. There were no banners, no cheering. There were quiet reunions, hands clasping, faces wet with the kind of relief that does make for songs. Asha's mother found her first, and for a moment the world stood still. Their embrace was close and wordless. I stayed back, because some moments are not for intruders. Later, as darkness folded the camp and people told their stories in whispers, Asha's mother pulled me aside. She looked me over like someone deciding whether to trust a man who had no right to ask for anything. Then, with a half-smile that belonged on a woman who had seen too much to be shocked, she said a single sentence in my tongue. You gave her water when the river would not. She clasped my hands as if making me kin, and in that clasp I felt something settle that had been loose in me for too long. We did stay long. The survivors needed time to rebuild, to stitch together what could be saved. Asha's place, what family remained, needed her. We parted with promises that were more like guesses, but not without a kind of warmth that felt honest. I thought then that our road might split. She back to the people she'd found, and me to the horizon I'd always chased. For a while I accepted that. It made sense on paper. It was tidy. But some bonds are not content to be tidy. Asha returned to me a week later, not as someone coming to beg or plead, but as a person who had decided to walk beside me by choice. Her mother had asked her to help, to stay for a season. But Asha had shrugged that off with the same stubborn grin she'd had the day the river nearly took her. The world is wide, she told me, and there are places I must see with my own feet. She climbed into the saddle beside me and grinned like a conspirator. From then on, our travels were less a quest and more a partnership. We moved with a kind of ease born from shared hardship. She'd point out a patch of edible roots, and I'd show her a shortcut through a rocky pass. We laughed in small, tired ways and argued about the best way to mend a rein. Sometimes the gulf of quiet between us grew wide and filled with unspoken things. Other times we spoke until the stars burned out. I learned that saving someone does always mean you've done the biggest thing you could for them. Sometimes saving someone is the beginning of being saved yourself. She pulled me out of the numbness I'd been drowning in and offered a life that required care and courage. In return, I taught her a few things about survival that weren't in her songs. We shaped each other not by accident but on purpose. By the time we reached the high plateau where the wind runs like a rumor, two shadows rode wherever we went. I didn't know what the future would hold. I didn't know whether we'd find more kin or more enemies, whether the raiders would come back, or whether the peace we carved would last. But I knew something else with an iron certainty. My life was no longer mine alone. I had pulled Asha from a river once, yes, but she had done more. She gave me a reason to keep moving forward. If you've stayed by the fire with us through this chapter, felt the cold slap of the river and the heat of the camp, then I am glad. There's more to this road than one rescue or one battle. There are other valleys, other people, and other choices waiting. If you want to keep riding with us, to see where the trail bends and what the next morning brings, then stay close, subscribe, saddle up, and ride with us into the next chapter of this wandering, stubborn, and strangely hopeful tale